The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday evening, the kind that makes you regret every decision that led you out of your house. Beth Harper sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, watching the windshield wipers fight a losing battle against the downpour. She was already running late, and now she'd have to make a run for it across the parking lot. Her grandmother had been in the hospital for 3 days now. Nothing too serious, just a bad case of pneumonia that needed monitoring. Still, Beth tried to visit every evening after work, even though her grandmother always scolded her for making the drive across town in rush hour traffic. Today had been particularly brutal at the office. Her boss had dumped a last-minute presentation on her desk at 4 in the afternoon, expecting it done by tomorrow morning. Beth had stayed an extra hour trying to make a dent in it before guilt drove her to the hospital. She'd finish it later tonight, she told herself. Her grandmother came first. She grabbed her purse and the small bouquet of daisies she'd picked up from the grocery store, took a deep breath, and opened the car door. The rain immediately soaked her shoulders as she jogged toward the hospital entrance, dodging puddles and trying to protect the flowers under her jacket. The automatic doors whooshed open, greeting her with that unmistakable hospital smell, that mix of disinfectant and cafeteria food and something else she could never quite name. The lobby was quiet for an early evening. Just a few people scattered in the waiting area, some staring at their phones, others at the muted television mounted on the wall. Beth headed straight for the elevators, water dripping from her coat onto the polished floor. She pressed the button for the 4th floor and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for just a moment. The tiredness hit her all at once. She'd been running on coffee and stress all day, barely touching the sandwich she'd bought for lunch. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another email. She pulled it out and saw it was from her boss, adding more notes to that presentation. Beth felt her jaw tighten as she read through the message. Did this really need to be sent at 6:30 in the evening? Could it not wait until tomorrow morning? The elevator dinged and the doors slid open on the 4th floor. Beth stepped out, still staring at her phone, typing a quick response to let her boss know she'd received the message. Her fingers moved across the screen automatically as her feet carried her down the hallway. Room 412. That's where her grandmother was. 4th floor. Turn left out of the elevator, down the corridor past the nurse's station. She'd made this walk 3 times already this week. She didn't need to look up. Except tonight, still focused on that annoying email, her mind churning through work problems. Beth turned left and kept walking. Her muscle memory should have stopped her at the right door, but something was off. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the way her thoughts were tangled up in presentation slides and deadline pressure. Whatever it was, when she finally looked up from her phone and saw a door in front of her, she just assumed it was the right one. She pushed it open, expecting to see her grandmother propped up in bed, probably watching one of those game shows she loved. Instead, she stepped into a room that was darker than she expected. The curtains were drawn and only a small light above the bed was on, casting long shadows across the walls. Beth froze in the doorway, confusion washing over her. This wasn't her grandmother's room. The layout was similar, sure, but everything else was different. No get-well cards taped to the wall. No little TV tray with magazines and a water pitcher. No familiar face smiling at her arrival. An elderly man lay in the bed completely still. The only sound was the steady beep of a heart monitor, and a strange rattling noise she couldn't quite place. For a second, Beth thought maybe she'd gotten the floor wrong. Maybe she'd gotten off at the 3rd floor instead of the 4th. She was about to back out quietly, apologize if she'd woken him, and check the room number when something made her stop. The man's skin looked strange in the dim light, too pale, almost gray, and his chest, she realized with growing alarm, was barely moving. Beth stood there, one hand still on the door handle, her mind racing. Should she leave? This wasn't her business. She'd clearly walked into the wrong room, but something felt very wrong about what she was seeing. The beeping from the heart monitor didn't sound right either. It wasn't steady. It would beep a few times, then pause too long, then beep again in an irregular rhythm that made her stomach clench. She took a tentative step into the room, letting the door close softly behind her. The flowers in her hand suddenly felt absurd, out of place. Her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting and she could see the man's face more clearly now. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older. Thin white hair, deep wrinkles around his eyes. But it was his lips that caught her attention. They had a bluish tint that she'd only seen once before, years ago, when her uncle had a heart attack at a family barbecue. Beth's heart started pounding. She glanced around the room quickly. Where was the call button? She spotted it clipped to the side of the bed, but it had fallen onto the floor, the cord stretched to its limit, completely out of the patient's reach. The man's eyes fluttered open for just a second. They were unfocused, confused, maybe even scared. He seemed to be trying to say something, but no words came out. Then his eyes closed again and his breathing became even more shallow. Every instinct told Beth to run out and get help, but something deeper, some gut feeling she couldn't explain, told her there wasn't time for that. This man needed help right now, this second. Not in the 30 seconds it would take her to find a nurse. She dropped her purse and the daisies on the chair by the door and rushed to the bedside. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the emergency call button on the wall above the bed. She pressed it once, twice, 3 times, not knowing if it was actually working or if anyone would respond. Then she looked back at the man, really looked at him, trying to remember anything from that CPR class she'd taken at work 2 years ago. What were the signs of a heart attack? Of stroke? Of respiratory failure? Her mind was blank with panic, but her eyes kept going back to that rattling sound and his struggling chest movements. That's when she saw it. The oxygen tube that should have been in his nose was twisted and had slipped down to his chin. The cannula completely dislodged. The oxygen was flowing into empty air instead of into his lungs. She didn't know how long it had been like that, but judging by his color and his breathing, it had been too long. Beth had entered the wrong room completely by accident, distracted by work emails and rain and exhaustion. But as she stood there staring at this stranger who was clearly in serious trouble, she realized that this might have been the most important mistake she'd ever make. Beth's hands were trembling so badly she could barely think straight. The oxygen tube lay there against the man's shoulder, useless while he struggled to breathe. She'd pressed the emergency button, but what if no one was coming? What if they thought it was a false alarm? What if she was supposed to do something else first? Her mind raced back to that training session at her office. It was a boring Thursday afternoon, and honestly, she'd spent half the class checking her emails under the table. But some of it had stuck. The instructor had been very clear about one thing. If someone can't breathe, nothing else matters. Get air into their lungs first, worry about everything else later. Beth took a shaky breath and leaned over the bed rail. The oxygen tube felt strange in her fingers, slippery and lightweight. She'd never touched one before. What if she did this wrong? What if she made things worse? But looking at the man's gray face and blue-tinged lips, she knew doing nothing wasn't an option. Very carefully, she straightened out the twisted tubing. Her hands steadied a little as she focused on this one simple task. The cannula, those little prongs that go into the nostrils, was dangling near his neck. She gently lifted it and positioned it back under his nose, trying to remember how she'd seen it worn before. The prongs went up into the nostrils and the tube looped over the ears. She adjusted it as gently as she could, terrified of hurting him but more terrified of doing nothing. Almost immediately, she heard the soft hiss of oxygen flowing properly again. The man's chest seemed to rise a little more with his next breath. Was that her imagination? Was she making a difference, or was she just desperately hoping she was? "Come on," she whispered, not even sure if she was talking to him or to herself. "Just breathe. Please just breathe." Seconds felt like hours. The heart monitor continued its irregular beeping, and Beth kept glancing at the door, willing someone to burst through it. Where were the nurses? Didn't that emergency button mean anything? She looked at the man's face again. His color seemed maybe possibly slightly better. Or was that just the lighting? She couldn't just stand there and wait. What if the button wasn't working? What if everyone was busy with another emergency? Beth made a split-second decision and ran to the door, yanking it open so hard it banged against the wall. "Help!" she shouted into the hallway. Her voice came out higher and more panicked than she expected. "I need help in here. Please, somebody." A nurse's head popped up from behind the station desk halfway down the corridor. She looked startled, and for a horrible moment, Beth thought she might tell her to be quiet, that this was a hospital and people were trying to rest. But the nurse must have seen something in Beth's face, heard something in her voice, because she immediately stood up and started moving fast. "What's wrong?" "The patient, he can't breathe. His oxygen thing was off. I don't know what's happening." The words tumbled out in a rush. The nurse broke into a run, and another nurse appeared from a room down the hall. Within seconds, both of them were pushing past Beth into the room. The first nurse went straight to the man, checking his pulse, looking at the monitors, adjusting the oxygen flow. The second nurse was already picking up a phone on the wall, speaking in that calm but urgent voice healthcare workers seem to master. Dr. Patel to 418. Stat. Dr. Patel to 418. Beth pressed herself against the wall, suddenly feeling very much in the way. She watched as the nurses moved around the bed with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, asking each other questions in medical terminology she didn't understand. Oxygen sat was down to 72, one of them said. And even though Beth didn't know what that meant exactly, the concern in the nurse's voice told her it was bad. It's coming back up. 81 now. 85. A doctor rushed in, a woman in her 40s with her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a stethoscope around her neck. She didn't even glance at Beth, just went straight to the patient, listening to his chest, checking his eyes with a small light. "What happened?" she asked, her hands moving quickly and surely. The first nurse explained while checking the monitors. "Found with oxygen cannula completely dislodged. Patient is under sedation for pain management post-pneumonia. Couldn't have reached the call button or alerted anyone." The doctor nodded, her face serious. "How long was he without oxygen?" "Unknown. This woman found him and replaced the cannula." The nurse gestured to Beth without looking at her. For the first time, the doctor turned to look at Beth. "Did you see when his oxygen came off?" Beth shook her head, feeling suddenly very small. "No, I just walked in and saw it wasn't on him." "I don't know how long. I'm sorry, I don't know." "You pressed the emergency call?" the doctor asked. "Yes, and I put the oxygen thing back. I didn't know what else to do." Something shifted in the doctor's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening. "You did exactly right. Oxygen first, always." Then she turned back to her patient, all business again. "Let's get another set of vitals. I want blood work. And someone check his chart, find out how he managed to dislodge this." The room became a flurry of activity. More people came in, a medical cart was wheeled over, and Beth found herself being gently guided backward until she was standing in the doorway, watching but no longer in the middle of everything. Her legs felt weak suddenly. The adrenaline that had been powering her for the last few minutes was draining away, leaving her shaky and slightly nauseous. She just walked into a random room and found someone dying, actually dying, if she'd turned right instead of left, if she'd stayed focused on her phone instead of looking up, if she'd backed out of the room the second she realized her mistake. The thoughts made her dizzy. "Miss? Are you all right?" One of the nurses had stepped out into the hallway with her. "You look pale. Do you need to sit down?" "I'm okay," Beth managed, even though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Is he going to be okay?" The nurse glanced back into the room. "His oxygen levels are improving. You got to him in time. Another few minutes, though." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Beth felt something cold settle in her stomach. Another few minutes. That's all it would have taken. She looked at her watch and was shocked to see that less than 10 minutes had passed since she'd walked into the wrong room. 10 minutes. That's how quickly someone's entire life could change. Or end. "I should go," Beth said quietly. "My grandmother, she's actually in 412. I was going to visit her." The nurse's eyebrows went up. "You're not this patient's family?" "No. I walked into the wrong room by mistake." For a moment, the nurse just stared at her. Then she reached out and squeezed Beth's arm gently. "Well, thank God for wrong turns. What's your name?" "Beth Harper." "Beth, you saved that man's life tonight. I hope you know that." Beth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The nurse gave her arm one more squeeze and went back into the room. Through the doorway, Beth could see the patient, the elderly man whose name she didn't even know. His color looked better now, more pink than gray. The heart monitor's beeping had settled into a steadier rhythm. She picked up her purse and the daisies from where she'd dropped them on the chair. The flowers were a bit crushed, but they'd survived. Just like the man in the bed, she thought. They'd both survived something tonight. As Beth walked down the corridor toward room 412, her grandmother's actual room, she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She kept thinking about those blue lips, that irregular heartbeat, that oxygen tube lying useless against his shoulder. She'd walked into the wrong room completely by accident, but somehow, impossibly, it had been exactly the right place to be. Beth stood outside room 412 for a long moment before going in. Her hand was still on the door handle, but she couldn't quite make herself push it open. She could hear the television through the door. One of those game shows with the overly enthusiastic host and the constant dinging of bells. Everything felt surreal. 5 minutes ago, she'd been watching doctors and nurses swarm around a dying man. Now she was supposed to walk in and have a normal conversation with her grandmother about the weather and what they served for dinner, and whether the nurse with the red hair was working tonight. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. There you are. Her grandmother, Helen, was propped up in bed with pillows, looking far better than she had 3 days ago. I thought maybe you weren't coming. It's already past 7. Sorry, Graham got stuck at work. Beth managed to smile and held up the slightly crushed daisies. Brought you these. Helen's face lit up. Oh, they're beautiful, even if they look like they've been through a war. What happened to them? Long story. Beth found a plastic cup in the small bathroom, filled it with water, and arranged the flowers as best she could. Her hands were finally starting to steady. You look terrible, honey, Helen said, studying her with those sharp eyes that never missed anything. Are you eating enough? You're working too hard at that job. I'm fine, Graham, just tired. Beth pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, grateful to be off her feet. How are you feeling? You look a lot better than yesterday. They fell into their usual rhythm. Helen complained about the food, praised one nurse and criticized another, and caught Beth up on all the hospital gossip she'd managed to collect despite being confined to one room. Apparently, the woman across the hall had 7 children who all visited at once, and the man 2 doors down sang opera in his sleep. Beth listened and nodded and made the appropriate responses, but her mind kept drifting back to room 418. Was the man awake now? Were his family members there? Did he even have family? The nurse had said she saved his life, but it still didn't feel real. Beth, are you listening to me? Sorry, what? Helen tilted her head, her expression shifting from annoyed to concerned. Something happened. What is it? Nothing, I'm just tired. Don't give me that. I've known you since you were in diapers. Something's bothering you. Beth opened her mouth to deny it again, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt her eyes start to burn with tears she'd been holding back. I walked into the wrong room when I got here. Helen waited, saying nothing, just watching her granddaughter's face. There was a man in there, and he couldn't breathe, and his oxygen thing had come off. And I thought... Beth's voice cracked. I thought he was going to die right in front of me. Oh, honey. Helen reached out and took Beth's hand. But he didn't? No, the doctors came and he's okay, I think. They said I got there in time. Beth wiped her eyes with her free hand. It was so scary, Graham, I didn't know what to do. But you did something. That's what matters. They sat in silence for a moment, Helen holding Beth's hand the way she had when Beth was little and had scraped her knee or had a nightmare. You know what's crazy? Beth said quietly. If I hadn't been looking at my phone, I wouldn't have turned the wrong way. If I'd been paying attention, I would have come straight here and that man would have just died. And no one would have known until it was too late. Helen squeezed her hand. But you did turn the wrong way. And you did look up. And you did help him. That's not crazy, sweetheart. That's a miracle. Beth stayed with her grandmother for another hour, and it helped, just being there in the familiar presence of someone who'd known her forever. But when visiting hours ended and she headed back to the elevators, she couldn't help slowing down as she passed room 418. The door was partially open now, and she could see more people inside. A woman about her age was sitting in the chair Beth had dropped her purse on earlier. An older teenage boy stood by the window. They were talking to the man in the bed, who was awake now, looking exhausted but alive. Beth didn't stop. It wasn't her place. These were strangers, and she'd done what she needed to do. But as she pressed the elevator button, she heard footsteps behind her. Excuse me? Are you Beth? She turned to find the woman from room 418 standing in the hallway, her eyes red like she'd been crying. Yes? I'm Claire. I'm his daughter. The woman gestured back toward the room. That's my dad, Robert. The nurses told me what you did. Beth didn't know what to say. I was in the wrong room. You saved his life. Claire's voice broke and she pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to compose herself. I'm sorry, I don't mean to fall apart on you. It's just... He's all I have left. My mom died 2 years ago, and my dad is everything to me and my son. And if you hadn't been there... I'm glad I could help, Beth said softly, feeling awkward and overwhelmed and strangely close to tears again herself. Claire reached out and pulled Beth into a hug. It was unexpected and tight and desperate, and Beth found herself hugging her back. This complete stranger who'd almost lost her father tonight. "Thank you," Claire whispered. "Thank you so much." When they pulled apart, Claire wiped her eyes. The doctor said another 5 minutes and his brain would have started losing oxygen. Another 10 and he probably wouldn't have made it. You got there exactly when you needed to. The elevator dinged and the doors opened, but Beth didn't move to get in. "How's he doing now?" "Much better. They're monitoring him closely, but he's stable. He's still pretty groggy from the medication, but he's coherent. He actually asked about you, the woman who helped him." Claire smiled through her tears. Would you want to meet him?" "He'd really like to say thank you himself." Beth hesitated. Part of her wanted to just go home, process everything that had happened, maybe have a good cry in private, but looking at Claire's hopeful face, she couldn't say no. "Okay, just for a minute." They walked back to room 418 together. The teenage boy looked up as they entered, and Beth recognized something in his eyes. That same fear she'd seen in Claire's, the fear of almost losing someone you love. The man in the bed, Robert, turned his head when he heard them come in. He looked so different now, with color in his cheeks and clarity in his eyes. He smiled weakly when he saw Beth. "You're the angel who wandered into my room," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "I'm not an angel," Beth said, stepping closer to the bed. "I'm just someone who got lost on the way to visit my grandmother." Best wrong turn anyone ever made. Robert's hand trembled as he lifted it, and Beth took it gently. His grip was weak but sincere. "Thank you for not just walking away when you realized your mistake. I couldn't. You needed help. A lot of people would have just left. Found a nurse, not wanted to get involved." Robert's eyes were bright with emotion. "But you stayed. You helped. You saved my life." Beth felt the weight of those words settle over her. She'd saved his life. This man, this father and grandfather, was alive because she'd walked into the wrong room and made the choice to help instead of walking away. "I'm just glad you're okay," she managed to say. They talked for a few more minutes. Beth learned that Robert was a retired teacher, that he'd been in the hospital recovering from pneumonia, that the medication they'd given him for pain had made him sleep so deeply he didn't realize his oxygen had come off. Claire told her about her son Tyler, who was planning to apply for college next year. Tyler showed her a picture on his phone of Robert at his last basketball game, healthy and smiling, and Beth felt grateful all over again that she'd been there tonight. When she finally left the hospital and walked to her car, the rain had stopped. The parking lot was slick and shiny under the streetlights, reflecting everything like a mirror. Beth sat in her car for a long moment before starting the engine, just thinking about everything that had happened. She'd left work frustrated and tired, worried about a presentation, and annoyed with her boss. Those things seemed so small now, so insignificant. Tonight she'd held someone's life in her hands, literally. Tonight she'd been exactly where she needed to be, even though she'd had no idea she was going there. As she drove home through the quiet streets, Beth realized something had shifted inside her. The world felt different somehow. More fragile, maybe, but also more precious, more worth paying attention to. Beth thought that would be the end of it. A strange, meaningful moment in her life that she'd remember forever, but something that would fade into the background as regular life took over again. She was wrong. The next morning, she was at her desk trying to focus on that presentation when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Is this Beth Harper?" A professional-sounding woman's voice. "Yes, this is Beth. Ms. Harper, this is Patricia Klein from Mercy General Hospital. I'm the patient relations coordinator. I wanted to reach out personally to thank you for your quick actions last night with Mr. Robert Chen." Beth sat back in her chair, surprised. "Oh, you're welcome. I'm just glad he's okay. He's doing very well, actually, but we wanted to follow up with you. What you did was remarkable, and we'd like to recognize it properly. Would you be willing to come by the hospital? There's someone from our communications team who'd like to speak with you." "I don't know if that's necessary," Beth said, feeling uncomfortable. "I really just did what anyone would do." "That's exactly the point, Ms. Harper. Most people wouldn't. Most people would have walked away, found someone else, assumed it wasn't their problem." "You didn't." Patricia paused. "We'd really appreciate it if you'd consider it." No pressure, of course, Beth agreed, mostly because she didn't know how to say no politely. They scheduled a meeting for that afternoon during her lunch break. Work was impossible to focus on anyway. Her co-workers kept asking if she was okay, noticing her distracted state. Finally, her friend Kelly cornered her by the coffee machine. "All right, spill it. What's going on with you? You've been staring at your computer for an hour, and I'm pretty sure you haven't typed a single word." Beth found herself telling the whole story. Kelly's eyes got wider and wider as she listened. Wait. You're telling me you accidentally walked into a random room and saved someone's life?" "I didn't save his life. I just put his oxygen back and got help." "Beth, that's literally saving his life." "Oh my God, that's incredible." Kelly grabbed her arm excitedly. "This is like something from a movie." It didn't feel like a movie. It was terrifying, but Kelly was already pulling out her phone. "You have to let me tell people about this. This is amazing." "No, please don't." Beth felt her stomach tighten. "It's private. It's not something to post about." Kelly looked disappointed but agreed. Still, by the time Beth left for the hospital at noon, she'd already told the story to 3 other people who'd stopped by her desk, drawn by Kelly's excited whispers. At the hospital, Patricia Klein turned out to be a warm woman in her 50s who greeted Beth like an old friend. She walked her to a small conference room where a younger woman with a camera and notebook was waiting. "Beth, this is Allison from our communications department. If you're comfortable, we'd love to share your story. It's the kind of positive news that reminds people why we do what we do here." Beth shifted uncomfortably. "I don't really want to be in the news or anything." "We completely understand," Allison said quickly. "We wouldn't use your full name or photo without permission. But stories like yours inspire people. They remind others to pay attention, to get CPR certified, to not be afraid to help. You'd be surprised how many people freeze in an emergency because they're scared of doing the wrong thing." Beth thought about that, about how her hands had been shaking, how she'd been terrified she'd make things worse. But she'd done it anyway. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." Before Beth left, Patricia walked her upstairs. "I thought you might want to know that Robert asked about you this morning. He's being moved out of intensive monitoring this afternoon. He's doing that well." They stopped outside room 418. Claire was there again, and this time an older woman was with her. Robert was sitting up in bed, looking exponentially better than he had the night before. He was eating lunch, actual food, and the color in his face was healthy and normal. "Beth?" Claire stood up when she saw her. "Dad, look who's here." Robert's face brightened. "The woman who saved my life." Come in." Beth entered hesitantly, very aware of Patricia standing in the doorway watching the reunion. "I wanted you to meet my sister Dorothy," Robert said, gesturing to the older woman. "Dorothy, this is Beth, the guardian angel I told you about." Dorothy came forward and took both of Beth's hands in hers. "Thank you. Thank you so much. Robert is the last sibling I have left. I don't know what I would have done if—" Her voice broke. "I'm glad I was there," Beth said, meaning it. They talked for a while. Robert was more alert now, able to tell her about his life. He'd taught high school English for 40 years. His wife had passed away from cancer. He had Claire and Tyler and a small garden at home that he missed terribly. He talked about the books he loved and the students he remembered and how he couldn't wait to get out of this hospital bed. Listening to him, Beth realized something. This wasn't just a man she'd helped. This was a whole person, with a whole life, with people who loved him and memories spanning decades and a future he still wanted to live. The weight of it hit her differently than it had the night before. When she finally left, promising to visit again soon, she found Claire waiting in the hallway. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "Why did you come back? Last night after you'd already been thanked? After you could have just gone home?" Beth thought about it. "I guess I needed to know he was really okay. That it wasn't just the nurses being nice, you know?" Claire smiled. "Tyler hasn't stopped talking about you. He keeps saying it's like a superhero origin story. Random person in the right place at the right time." She paused. "I know the hospital wants to share your story. I think you should let them." "Why?" "Because people need to hear things like this. The news is always full of terrible stuff, scary stuff, but this is about someone who cared enough to help a stranger. That's the kind of story people need right now." Beth drove back to work thinking about what Claire had said. That evening, she called Allison and gave her permission to share the story, though she still didn't want her photo used. Just the facts, she said. Just what happened. 3 days later, the hospital posted the story on their website and social media. They'd titled it The Right Wrong Turn and kept Beth's identity mostly private, using only her first name. But they'd included quotes from Robert and Claire, and somehow that made it more real, more touching. Beth didn't expect what happened next. The story got picked up by a local news station, then another. By the weekend, it had gone viral on social media. Her phone exploded with messages from friends and distant relatives she hadn't talked to in years. Even her boss sent her an email, saying he was proud to have her on the team. Kelly printed out some of the comments people had left on the hospital's post and brought them to Beth's desk. Hundreds of people sharing their own stories of helping strangers, or being helped by strangers. People thanking Beth for reminding them to pay attention. Several people said they'd signed up for CPR classes because of her story. "You started something," Kelly said. "Look at all these people getting inspired." Beth read through the comments, overwhelmed. There was one from a woman who said she'd found her neighbor unconscious last year and had been too scared to help, just called 911 and waited. "Your story made me realize I could have done more," she wrote. "I'm taking a first aid class next week. I never want to feel that helpless again." That night, Beth couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that woman's comment, about all the comments. She'd done one thing, one small thing really, and somehow it had rippled out into the world in ways she never imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Dad's coming home tomorrow. Doctors say he's made a full recovery. We're having a small celebration at our house next weekend. Please come. We'd love to have you there." Beth stared at the message for a long time. A week ago, she didn't know these people existed. She'd been focused on work deadlines and presentations and impressing her boss. Now she was being invited to celebrate a stranger's homecoming, a stranger who'd become something more than that. She typed back, "I'd love to come. Thank you for including me." As she set her phone down, Beth looked out her apartment window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Robert was preparing to go home. Somewhere, people were signing up for CPR classes. Somewhere, someone might be paying a little more attention, looking up from their phone, noticing things they would have missed. All because she'd turned left instead of right. All because she'd walked into the wrong room at exactly the right time. The following Saturday, Beth stood on the front porch of a modest house in the suburbs, holding a bouquet of flowers and wondering if she'd overdressed. Through the window, she could see people moving around inside, hear laughter and conversation. She'd almost talked herself out of coming 3 times that morning. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Tyler stood there with a huge grin on his face. "Beth, you came. Grandpa's been asking about you every 5 minutes. He held the door open wide. Come in, come in." The house smelled like home cooking and fresh flowers. There were balloons tied to chairs and a banner hanging in the living room that said, "Welcome home, Robert." About 20 people were scattered throughout the space, talking and laughing. Beth recognized Claire immediately, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Beth!" Claire rushed over and hugged her like they were old friends. "I'm so glad you made it. Come meet everyone." Dad's in the living room holding court like always. Robert was sitting in a comfortable recliner, looking healthy and animated, gesturing with his hands as he told a story to a small group gathered around him. When he saw Beth, his whole face lit up. "There she is. The woman of the hour." He tried to stand, but Claire gently pushed him back down. "Dad, you're supposed to be taking it easy." "I've been taking it easy for 2 weeks. I'm fine." But he stayed seated, reaching out to take Beth's hand when she came closer. "I'm so happy you're here. Let me introduce you to everyone." The next hour was a blur of names and faces. Robert's sister Dorothy, his cousins, old teaching colleagues, neighbors, friends from his book club. Everyone wanted to meet her, to thank her, to hear the story from her perspective. Beth felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also touched by how much these people clearly loved Robert. "You know what the funny thing is?" Robert said during a quiet moment when most people had moved to the dining room for food. "I don't remember any of it. The sedation they had me on, I was completely out. 1 minute I'm sleeping, the next I'm waking up with doctors all around me and Claire crying." He looked at Beth seriously. "They told me later how close it was, how if you'd been even a few minutes later." "But I wasn't," Beth said softly. "No, you weren't. And I keep thinking about that, about all the little things that had to happen for you to be there at that exact moment. You had to work late. You had to get caught in the rain. You had to be distracted enough to turn the wrong way, but alert enough to notice something was wrong. He shook his head in wonder. That's not coincidence. That's something else. Claire sat down on the arm of her father's chair. Mom used to say there are no accidents, just things we don't understand yet. Her voice got soft when she mentioned her mother. I think she would have said you were sent to us, Beth. Beth didn't know what to say to that. She'd never been particularly religious or spiritual, but sitting there looking at Robert surrounded by all these people who loved him, people who would have been mourning instead of celebrating if things had gone differently, she couldn't quite dismiss it as pure chance either. Tyler came over with a plate of food for his grandfather. Grandpa, you need to eat something. Mom's orders. When did you get so bossy? Robert teased, but he took the plate. Tyler turned to Beth. Did my mom tell you? I signed up to be a volunteer EMT. They have a youth program at the fire department. I start training next month. Really? That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, after what happened with Grandpa, I kept thinking about how important it is to know what to do in an emergency. How you knew what to do. He looked a little embarrassed. I want to be able to help people like that too. Beth felt something warm spread through her chest. You're going to be great at it. As the afternoon wore on, Beth found herself relaxing, actually enjoying the party. She talked with Dorothy about gardening, learned about Robert's 40 years of teaching from his former colleagues, and heard stories about Claire's mother that made everyone laugh and cry at the same time. At one point, she found herself in the kitchen with Claire, helping put together a tray of desserts. I need to tell you something, Claire said, her voice quiet. The night it happened after you left and things calmed down, I just sat by Dad's bed and cried for an hour straight. I kept thinking about how close I came to losing him, how I would have had to call Tyler and tell him his grandfather was gone, how I would have had to plan a funeral instead of a welcome home party. She wiped her eyes. And then I thought about you, this complete stranger who had no reason to care, who could have just walked away and found a nurse. But you didn't. I couldn't, Beth said simply. I know. And that's what makes you special. Claire put her hand on Beth's arm. You're part of our family now, whether you like it or not. Beth laughed, but there were tears in her eyes too. I think I like it. Before she left that evening, Robert called everyone together in the living room. He stood up, waving away Claire's protests, and raised his glass of apple cider. I want to make a toast, he said. 2 weeks ago, I came very close to not being here. But I am here because of the incredible doctors and nurses at Mercy General, and because of Beth Harper, who happened to walk into the wrong room at exactly the right time. He looked directly at Beth. You gave me more time. Time with my daughter and grandson. Time to finish that garden. Time to read all those books I've been meaning to get to. Time to make more memories with all of you wonderful people. That's a gift I can never repay, but I can promise you this. I won't waste it. Everyone raised their glasses, and Beth felt tears streaming down her face. Robert made his way over to her and pulled her into a gentle hug. Thank you, he whispered. For everything. That night, driving home, Beth thought about how much her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She'd made new friends. She'd inspired strangers on the internet. She'd learned that she was braver than she thought she was. And she'd gained a new family, one that had welcomed her in with open arms. But more than that, something fundamental had shifted in how she saw the world. She paid more attention now. To the people around her, to the small moments that could become big ones, to the opportunities to help that she might have missed before. At work, she'd started being kinder to her co-work. Checking in on people more. She'd finally signed up for that CPR renewal class she'd been putting off. She even started volunteering one Saturday a month at a community center, teaching basic first aid to anyone who wanted to learn. Her grandmother Helen had noticed the change. You seem different, she'd said during a recent visit. Lighter somehow, maybe that was it. Beth felt lighter, less caught up in the small stresses and more focused on what actually mattered. The presentation that had seemed so important that rainy Tuesday night. She'd finished it and it had gone fine, but she couldn't even remember what it was about now. It had felt urgent in the moment, but in the grand scheme of things it was just another task. Robert's life, though. That mattered. Tyler growing up with his grandfather, Claire not having to grieve, all those students Robert had taught over the years, the impact he'd had on them, the way he'd shaped their lives. That legacy continuing instead of ending. That mattered. A month after the party, Beth got a text from Robert. It was a photo of him in his garden, surrounded by tomato plants and sunflowers with a huge smile on his face. The message said, First harvest of the season. Come by for dinner sometime and I'll cook for you. Beth saved the photo. She looked at it sometimes when she was having a bad day, when work felt overwhelming or life felt heavy. It reminded her that she'd made a real difference. That one moment, one choice to help instead of walking away, had created ripples that kept spreading outward. She'd walked into the wrong room by complete accident. She'd been distracted and tired and just trying to visit her grandmother. But that mistake, that wrong turn, had led her exactly where she needed to be, and it taught her the most important lesson of all. We never really know which moments are going to matter, which split-second decisions will change everything, which wrong turns will end up being exactly right. All we can do is pay attention, be present, and be willing to help when help is needed. Because sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do starts with a simple mistake and a choice not to look away.